Okay, we're back with our second in a series of videos intended to help judges, coaches, and teams all prepare for ethics bowl competitions. And now we're talking about the commentary on the initial team's presentation, the response to commentary, and the response to judges' questions. So let's take a look now at the commentary on the initial team's presentation. The first point to note here is that teams' commentaries should show clear evidence of having listened carefully to the initial presentation, responding to points raised by the presenting team, or pointing out omissions of salient points. This might seem like common sense, but what we want to prevent is that all teams have been thinking carefully about all of these cases, and so teams may have a presentation ready to go for a case if they had received the case in the moderator's question. So we don't want to see is that a team sits and quote-unquote listens to an initial presentation and then simply presents what they would have presented if they had been asked the moderator's question. But that's hopefully a relatively low bar, and so beyond that we want to talk about some additional nuances here. So teams' commentary should reflect a good faith effort to have accurately understood the initial team's presentation. The idea here is that we don't want teams intentionally or unintentionally distorting a team's position in order to challenge it. So it's often a good idea, teams, to maybe consider offering a quick summary of what you take the initial presentation to have been, and then engaging in a commentary on what you thought was missing or could be developed more, or what you want to push back on. The other important point is that the whole idea of the Ethics Bowl is that it is a collegial discussion. And so you'll see this point repeated, but it's very important that commentaries be offered in the spirit of collegial conversation. So we don't want to encourage false politeness, but sincere collegiality in which people are trying to deepen the conversation by challenging points without being snotty about it. Commentary teams should also attempt to differentiate between what they take to be the most pressing issues and what they think issues are more peripheral. This is really important and something for judges to keep in mind as well. What we don't really want to see is a whole shower of possible things that they want the initial team to think about, with no differentiation about whether these things are more or less important than one another. And this is important. If you're new to the Ethics Bowl, this is one key way that the Ethics Bowl is very different from debate. Teams do not need to disagree with the initial team's position on the case. So what you might see is the team will say, we agree with your conclusion, but we think you failed to address a few issues. We want to challenge you on some other points, etc. So that brings us to the response to commentary. Of course, the job here is to respond to the commentary you've just heard. So teams should attempt to address the points raised by the commentary team. But they should decide for themselves which points are most pressing and which are less so. So you, as the team that is responding to a commentary, might think that a particular point that the commentary team thought was very important, you might decide it's less central and instead decide something else is a more central point for you to take up. So that is up to you to decide. Teams do not need to address every point raised by a commentary team. You might choose to only focus on the ones you think are most important. The judges should decide whether the team has dealt with the most pressing issues raised by the commentary team. And teams, again, you see this theme throughout, should respond to commentaries in the spirit of a collegial conversation, again, intended to deepen the ethical analysis of the case. In response to judges' question, this was developed considerably when the scoring guidelines were revamped. And so I'm going to talk at length through this, and then in the next video we'll take a look at the guide to asking judges' question as well as the etiquette guide for teams. So those will be together in video 3. Response to judges' questions. First, we have the expectations of judges. So judges have up to 1 minute to confer about which questions to ask before the time for the question and answer period begins. Quick note here, due to the virtual environment in the Ethics Bowl season 2020-2021, that conferral period might be extended. But the idea here is that there'll be some period of time where judges will confer about what questions they might want to ask. They shouldn't be conferring about how well they thought a team has done, what sort of scores they're giving, etc. Each judge is allowed to ask one question and one follow-up to the presenting team, and if there's time left after this, the judge may ask additional questions. There's no requirement that a judge ask a question. A judge may yield his or her question to another judge. However, and this is, I think, very, very important, if a judge felt that there were omissions or errors in the presenting team's view, judges should ask a question about this. In other words, choosing not to ask a question while giving a team a low score is not in the spirit of allowing teams opportunities to deepen the ethical analysis of the case. What we want very much to avoid is a judge just deciding that they very much just disagree with the team's position and they just sort of don't want to play anymore. What we want is that judges are always trying to offer teams opportunities to improve as the match proceeds. And again, you're going to see the same comment that's been mentioned above. Judges' questions should be in the spirit of a collegial conversation intended to deepen the analysis of the case. And the details here, though, are important. A good guideline is that the better the presentation, the tougher the question might be. So the teams that had a weaker presentation might have a chance to deepen their analysis by, maybe you ask a little bit of a softball, sort of almost giving them another bite at the apple. And this doesn't mean that you would go back and change your score for the initial presentation, but it does mean that perhaps a team could have a weak initial presentation, but do a very solid job in the judge Q&A. On the other side of that, a team might have had a very, very good initial presentation, and so a judge might ask a much tougher question in order to see if you can push the team a little further. You might change some fact or hypothetically about the case. You might ask them to approach something from another direction. You might push them with a counter argument, etc. Judges, though, should be mindful of the fact that there are only 10 minutes for the question and answer period. And this is important. I'm an academic. A lot of academics are fond of the sound of their own voice, as you can tell from me today. But you want to keep your questions short and concise so that teams have maximum ability to reply. One thing, I say this half jokingly, but I've seen it a lot over the years, is that judges' questions ought to actually be questions. Sometimes judges will talk for a minute or 2 minutes and there's no question mark at the end of their time speaking. So something to keep in mind. One last point, this is a somewhat minor point, but judges should really try to refrain from asking a question if we're down at the very, very end of our time. So if there's less than 30 seconds remaining, unless it's a question that can be answered in a word or two, you might just put it in your pocket. Now let's talk about expectations of the teams during the judge's Q&A. Teams can confer before answering a judge's question. Be mindful, though, of the time, so you want to keep these conferral periods short. You want to give a full but concise answer to a judge's question as well. In addition, teams should respond to questions from judges. Again, same theme as before, the spirit of collegial conversation intended to deepen the ethical analysis of the case. I want to pause here and just talk about this point as it relates to the judge Q&A. What we're really trying to avoid is a sort of badgering of the witness phenomenon. If a judge disagrees with the team's position, we want to get away from this sort of rapid fire back and forth where it seems like it's descended into more of a debate between the judge and the team than an attempt to probe for a deeper analysis of the case. So that said, finally, one thing that teams should remember is that a question from a judge that indicates disagreement with the team's position does not necessarily mean either that the judge in fact disagrees with the team's position or that disagreement with the team's position impacted the judge's score. So just to reference earlier, judges, you should not be basing your score whether or not you disagree with the team, but also teams, sometimes a judge will ask a question that indicates disagreement because that judge is simply trying to challenge you as a team. It's something to think about strategically as a team because you have to decide whether their question is in fact pointing out a flaw in your presentation and perhaps you should rethink it, or if in fact they're testing to see if you will abandon your position at the first sign of opposition from a judge. It's something that you have to think about as a team. So I'm going to end this video here. We're going to come back. We'll talk about the guide to etiquette for participants, as well as a guide to asking judges questions for newer judges.